Now, people with life and death emergencies are having to wait longer than ever before for an ambulance. Patient groups say that the wait of more than 90 minutes on average for people suffering heart attacks and strokes could lead to real harm.
So if England's ambulance services are at full stretch, should taxis be sent instead to bring people to hospital as quickly as possible? Well, let's talk about that, shall we? And joining us is GP Dr. Anita Raja, who says she doesn't think that we should normalise the use of taxis instead of ambulances. And writer and broadcaster Emma Wolf believes taxis would be a good idea. Well, look, Emma, let's start with you. Why send a taxi? Because isn't part of the point of sending an ambulance that you've got trained paramedics there that can start at the very second they arrive to treat the emergency and also decide whether it is an emergency or not?
Okay, I'm afraid on this, I would say send taxis, send tanks, send rickshaws, send anything. I'm a pragmatist, and if that's your mother or your father lying on the floor waiting up to 90 minutes for an ambulance, I think they need to get to hospital as soon as possible. Of course, we need the NHS and the health unions and the health secretary and everybody to negotiate to sort this terrible situation out. But in the current situation, I think we should be doing whatever we need to get people to hospital as soon as possible. And that doesn't mean expecting them to drive themselves or make their own way. We're not experts. We don't know if we're having a stroke, if we're having a heart attack, if it's a medical emergency, or maybe it's just indigestion. If you're a frail person, if you're blind, if you're in some way disabled, if you're elderly, how are you meant to know? We need people to be seen, and if that takes taxis, I'm afraid that's what it takes.
Emma, do you have any concern that you'd be putting an awful lot of pressure on the taxi driver to take that responsibility of somebody who could well be in a life-threatening condition? As you point out, they might not know how bad it is, and if anything were to go wrong while they were in the back of the taxi, that taxi driver's going to have to deal with the fallout from that.
Yeah, Ben, you're right. Taxi drivers seem to be pretty good at delivering babies and helping out in all sorts of ways. I don't know. All I know is I would prefer someone to be in a taxi at least getting to hospital than lying on their kitchen floor, with absolutely no help.
Dr. Anita, that's the point, isn't it? Nobody, including Emma, is recommending this is the best solution for somebody in the middle of a cardiac arrest or a stroke. But if the alternative is wait 90 minutes on average or have a taxi turn up and get you to help, isn't that better?
Certainly not. This is not an option at all. It's a big no. Taxis are not equipped to give you pre-hospital care. The idea of having an ambulance is having highly specialized equipment, medically trained staff who can make sure that you are transported safely to the hospital. Now, Emma has mentioned frail and elderly people. How do you think they would get into a taxi? They need a stretcher, they need equipment, they need a wheelchair. The taxi driver, the insurance will certainly not cover them to take responsibility of someone who may collapse in the back seat. And also, we've got to understand that, yes, it could be indigestion. It could be something as big as a stroke. But we have to understand that if the patient gets critically unwell, then what's the next step? For instance, if it is a stroke and they have an epileptic seizure and their airway is compromised, who's going to take the responsibility? Is it going to be the patient, the taxi driver? And there is absolutely no guarantee that once the taxi arrives at A&E, they're going to be given urgent medical care. They could be waiting another 7 hours before someone comes and tends to them. So I think this is a very dangerous suggestion we are making here. We should certainly not normalize this or encourage people to jump in the back of a taxi or a tank for that matter.
But then if the alternative is just lying on the kitchen floor with no help?
This is something that we need to address properly. I think I'm pretty fed up, like everyone else who works for the NHS, with short-term plans and solutions, a couple of 100 million here and there to overcome an adversity like this. If we're talking about this today in a first world country like Great Britain, then this is a big shame. I have worked in hospitals of third world countries, and let me tell you, even there such suggestions are not made. If we are in a position like this today, we certainly need to call out on ministers and policymakers for long-term solutions. We've always talked about replacing people, replace the GP with a GP assistant, replace the nurse with a nurse assistant, replace the ambulance drivers. Why can we not simply give people quality care with top-notch people who are qualified to do this job?
Yeah, I mean, no one would argue with that.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're not going to argue with that, are you?
I'm not going to argue with that. And with respect, of course, long-term solutions are needed, of course. But that is for the politicians. That is for the unions. That is for the managers. We are talking about patients on the ground. Let me quickly give you two very personal examples. One, a friend of hers in her late 70s. Her husband has Parkinson's. He's too big. If he has a fall, which he does frequently, what is she meant to do? How is she meant to help him or lift him or get him into the car? She's frail. Is she meant to drive him to hospital? Second example, I'm a single mother with a young toddler, with a 2-year-old. I don't drive. What am I meant to do? If I had a medical emergency, if my baby had a medical emergency, what am I meant to do? Should I call a taxi? I don't even know. Should I wait and wait and wait for an ambulance? I mean, I think that we have to remember, first and foremost, our health service is about people. It's about people who may, as I say, not be in a medical emergency, but they may be suffering life-threatening delays.
I think, Anita, I think one of the things is that and Emma's pointing out, and a few of the people getting in touch, is when there's urgency required and you're panicking to the point where you need to phone for an ambulance and you suddenly get told that an ambulance is going to take 90 minutes, is going to take 2 hours. Actually just being able to do something yourself, whether it's call a taxi or drive yourself or fortunately have someone to drive you, you're actually taking some sort of control. So at least when you get to A&E, you can be assessed quite quickly and they can decide how serious it is. And it's actually being able to take that control is something that we're all desperate to be able to have at the minute, because at the moment, the idea of having a family member lying on the floor for 90 minutes while they were having a heart attack or a stroke is just terrifying.
It certainly is terrifying, Ben, and the way the system is working at present is so disappointing. I mean, as I said before, we need long-term solutions, and yes, this is a debate which is very important now. But it's just so disappointing that we've reached a stage where we need to debate this.
Yeah.
I certainly don't think we can encourage people to jump in the back of a taxi. I'm sorry, that's just not safe.
I understand, Dr. Anita, and I think all of us would salute what you're saying. But what would you advise as a GP? Someone is facing a wait, they're frightened that it's a cardiac arrest, they're not strong enough or they don't drive. What would you say to them if they got through to you on the phone to do?
I definitely would call 991, 999 myself.
They've called 999 and they've been told the wait's too long. What would you tell them to do?
You can call 999 again and tell them that it is an emergency and that we are really worried. And they do upgrade that call. I certainly am not going to advise anyone. This is such a dangerous topic. How can we tell people to get in the back of a car or a taxi? That's just not right. What if the taxi driver refuses to take the patient? What if this is an elderly stuck on the 6th floor who's morbidly obese, like Emma has said, or is frail? I mean, this is just not safe. And, by the time they get into the taxi, they have a broken femur.
I still think that if my child was having a fit or some kind of febrile seizure, I would probably carry him into a taxi and get to hospital.
That's not a good idea at all, because I am telling you, this is not safe. They could have an airway compromise. You could kill them by doing that. And if you're happy to take that responsibility as a parent, that's fine. You can do that. But me as a medical profession, I would call out to people who make policies. I would ask them and urge them to get paramedics on the table for negotiation. We need to make this job lucrative so that top-notch, medically trained people take the lead and are there to help us. What do you think happens when people reach A&E? Do you think they're medically assessed ASAP? This is a misconception. Ambulances wait in the ambulance bay for 7 hours before they can offload people. Sometimes people are having an MI in the back of an ambulance as well, and we've seen this. So we certainly need to work at long-term solutions. Short-term fixes like jumping into a taxi are certainly not something I would advise anybody.
OK, well, look, we appreciate both of you joining us this morning. Lots of people getting in touch. And to be fair, the majority all saying it seems like a good idea. I think it is Belle that says, in theory, this seems like a good idea, but taxis are not equipped with medical equipment. And what happens if someone depends on it? You know, that's the reality, the responsibility.
What I think is that they've both raised is the fact that increasingly in this situation, the pressure comes on the individual to make medical decisions. I've used a lot of cabs for Derek to go to and from hospital appointments because the mobility services are very, very delayed. Ambulances are delayed. But if you try and book an official car, you can sometimes be waiting 5 hours for them to bring you home from hospital, and he was in a lot of pain. It wasn't sustainable. So we took a cab home from the hospital and went over a speed bump, and he slipped out of the wheelchair.
OK.
And
something that you would never have envisaged happening, or?
Well, you know, it's hard, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's hard to deal with. You want someone with you to manage that. Now, I was really lucky because the cab driver, black cab driver that had a mobility access, his father he'd cared for post a stroke, so he was really good at handling someone with that condition. So the two of us were hauling him back into the wheelchair,
to put him back in,
strapping him in and got him home. But I just thought, gosh, there's many taxi drivers who said, I can't deal with this.
Absolutely.
I'm not even sure I was meant to be dealing with this.
So in hindsight, do you feel like you should have waited?
Well, I don't know, because he was in such distress and pain. So I think you're having to all the time as individuals make calls which really you know you're not qualified for that. And it's very difficult.
We should point out that NHS England have given us this statement. They say, while services continue to be pressured, it's important that the public play their part by using the best services for their care. 999 in an emergency, otherwise using 111.
I should say that Derek was fine before anybody. He was absolutely fine. I mean, distressed, but fine. But I just think we're asking a lot of people that aren't qualified to do
Quite.
things.
And that, I think, is Dr. Anita's point, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.